The morning of June 14th, 1944, Saipan Island, Central Pacific. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood in the concrete command post overlooking Charan Kanoa, watching the horizon through field glasses as American warships appeared like grey shadows against the dawn. He had commanded the carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier. Now he commanded the Central Pacific Area Fleet from this 5-mile-wide island 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Behind him, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito studied the deployment maps with satisfaction. 30,000 troops garrisoned Saipan. Artillery pieces crowned the hills overlooking every beach. Machine gun nests and barbed wire fortifications covered the shoreline. Concrete pillboxes dotted the landscape. The island's cave systems had been transformed into defensive strongpoints with steel doors. Nagumo turned from the window. "The Americans will come tomorrow," he said quietly. "They will bypass the Carolines and strike here directly. Our intelligence confirms it." Saito nodded. "Let them come. Their island-hopping strategy means nothing here. This is not some undefended atoll in the Gilberts or Marshalls. Saipan is fortified. We are ready. They will bleed on these beaches until their casualties force them to negotiate peace." The two commanders shared a moment of confidence. For months, Japanese military planners had watched the American advance across the Pacific with a mixture of concern and contempt. The Americans had adopted what they called island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds to seize lightly defended islands. It was a strategy born of caution, they believed. The Americans feared direct confrontation with prepared defenses. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Tokyo had reinforced the outer defensive perimeter throughout 1943, but the Americans simply avoided those positions. Rabaul, the massive Japanese base in New Britain with over 100,000 troops, was isolated rather than attacked. Truk Lagoon, Japan's Pearl Harbor in the Caroline Islands, was bypassed. The pattern seemed clear to Japanese commanders. Americans would not assault prepared defenses when easier alternatives existed. This assessment shaped Japanese defensive planning throughout the Pacific. Resources flowed to obvious strategic targets. Commanders fortified locations they deemed critical, confident that their preparations would deter American assault. The calculus was simple. Make an objective costly enough, and the Americans would bypass it entirely. Saipan represented the ultimate test of this philosophy. The island sat in the Marianas Chain, close enough to Japan proper that B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo from airfields built on its soil. The Americans needed Saipan. They could not bypass it. They would have to assault prepared defenses directly or abandon their march toward Japan. Japanese planners believed they had created an impossible dilemma for American commanders: attack Saipan and face catastrophic casualties, or bypass it and sacrifice strategic momentum. Either choice served Japanese war aims. High casualties would undermine American public support for the war. Operational delay would grant Tokyo time to negotiate an acceptable peace. General Saito had expressed this confidence in communications to Tokyo weeks earlier. "The fate of the empire will be decided in this one action," he had written. But he followed with assurance. "Saipan's defenses are formidable. The enemy will not take this island without suffering losses they cannot sustain." The conviction stemmed from experience. At Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands 6 months earlier, American Marines had suffered 3,300 casualties in 76 hours, capturing an island barely 2 miles long. Japanese defenders, entrenched and prepared, had extracted a terrible price despite being outnumbered 10-1. The lesson seemed clear. Determined defenders in prepared positions could inflict unacceptable losses on attacking forces. Saipan's garrison was 60 times larger than Tarawa's. The island was 60 times the size. The defensive preparations were proportionally more extensive. By Japanese calculations, the Americans would need to commit forces so large and accept casualties so high that victory would be Pyrrhic at best. What Japanese commanders failed to recognize was that American strategy had evolved beyond simple island hopping. The bypassing of heavily defended positions was not caution, it was efficiency. American planners seized objectives that advanced strategic goals while avoiding battles that consumed resources without corresponding benefit. They did not fear prepared defenses. They simply prioritized targets that mattered. Saipan mattered. The Marianas mattered. These islands would bring American bombers within range of Japanese cities and sever supply lines to Japan's southern empire. No amount of fortification would deter an assault when the strategic value justified the cost. The confidence displayed by Nagumo and Saito on the morning of June 14th rested on a fundamental miscalculation. They believed American strategy was dictated by casualty aversion. In reality, it was dictated by strategic necessity. When an objective was essential, Americans would accept whatever cost victory required. They would not bypass Saipan, they would overwhelm it. The American approach to Pacific warfare in 1944 represented a dramatic evolution from earlier campaigns. The lessons of Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and the Gilbert and Marshall Islands had been absorbed and integrated into operational doctrine. What emerged was not merely island hopping, but a sophisticated strategy of selective advance that combined naval power, air, superiority, and massive amphibious assault capability. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet from offices that overlooked the harbor where Japanese bombs had fallen in December 1941. His staff had been planning the Marianas operation since the Quebec Conference in August 1943. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, had advocated for including the Marianas in the Central Pacific Offensive specifically because the strategic importance would force a decisive naval battle. General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, wanted the islands to provide secure airfields for the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. The confluence of naval and air strategic requirements made the Marianas invasion inevitable. It was designated Operation Forager. Saipan would be the first objective, followed by Tinian and Guam. The target date was set for June 15, 1944, 9 days after the Allied invasion of Normandy would commence in Europe. The force assembled for Operation Forager was unprecedented in Pacific warfare. Over 535 ships, more than 127,000 troops. The landing force consisted of the 2nd Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, commanded by Major General Thomas Watson. The 4th Marine Division, which had fought in the Marshalls, was commanded by Major General Harry Schmidt. The Army's 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard unit federalized in October 1940, provided reserves. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, known throughout the Corps as Howlin' Mad Smith, commanded the expeditionary troops. Smith was a Marine to his corps, aggressive and demanding, with little patience for what he perceived as insufficient combat aggression. His headquarters staff had studied every aspect of Saipan's defenses from aerial reconnaissance, photographs, and intelligence reports. The intelligence picture was incomplete but sobering. American planners estimated Japanese troop strength at 15 to 17,000. The actual garrison exceeded 30,000. Japanese defensive preparations were more extensive than photographs revealed. Artillery pieces were positioned on reverse slopes to avoid aerial observation. Cave systems provided protected storage for supplies and shelter for troops. The beach defenses included interlocking fields of fire from machine guns, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and obstacles designed to channel amphibious vehicles into killing zones. What American commanders understood, however, was that Japanese doctrine remained fundamentally defensive. The enemy would contest the landing at the waterline, attempt to destroy the invasion force on the beaches, then fall back to prepared positions inland. This predictability could be exploited through overwhelming firepower and superior combined arms coordination. The preparatory bombardment began on June 11th. Battleships that had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, their crews burned and drowned in December 1941, now unleashed their main batteries against Japanese positions. 15 battleships fired 165,000 shells over 3 days. Carrier-based aircraft struck defensive positions repeatedly. Underwater demolition teams swam to the invasion beaches at night to clear obstacles and map underwater terrain. The scale of American preparation reflected lessons learned from earlier operations. At Tarawa, insufficient reconnaissance and inadequate bombardment had contributed to high casualties. American planners were determined not to repeat those mistakes. Every aspect of the operation was planned in exhaustive detail. Supply requirements, casualty projections, evacuation procedures, artillery support schedules, and communication protocols were documented in operations orders that ran to hundreds of pages. But beneath the tamed, careful planning lay a harder truth. Saipan would not fall easily. The island's terrain favored defenders. Mount Tapachao rose 1,500 feet above the central plain, providing observation over the entire island. Deep ravines and thick vegetation created natural defensive barriers. The civilian population, over 30,000 Japanese colonists and indigenous Chamorro people, complicated operations in ways American forces had not previously encountered. Most significantly, Saipan represented something new in Pacific warfare. This was not a remote atoll garrisoned by a few thousand troops. It was a substantial landmass with a developed civilian infrastructure, held by a force large enough to conduct sustained defensive operations. Taking Saipan would require not a raid or a quick amphibious seizure, but a campaign. The American Marines and soldiers boarding ships in the Marshall Islands and Pearl Harbor in early June understood what awaited them. Many had fought at Tarawa or Kwajalein. They knew the reality of opposed amphibious landings. The landing craft crowded with equipment and men. The final approach through water, churned by explosions. The desperate rush across open beaches under fire. The confusion and violence of close combat. They knew that despite all the planning, despite the overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, men would die on those beaches. Many men. The only question was how many. For the Japanese defenders on Saipan, the American preparations were visible, but their full scale was not comprehended. Naval bombardment and airstrikes destroyed some defensive positions and killed men, but the garrisons remained largely intact. Radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance revealed the size of the approaching fleet, but Japanese commanders interpreted this through the lens of their strategic assumptions. The Americans were coming in force because they believed overwhelming numbers would compensate for lack of fighting spirit. The Americans would suffer high casualties because they attacked prepared defenses. When casualties reached unacceptable levels, the Americans would withdraw or seek negotiated settlement. These beliefs, deeply embedded in Japanese military culture and reinforced by early war victories, shaped expectations for the coming battle. Admiral Nagumo and General Saito were not fools. They understood the magnitude of American material advantage, but they believed that spirit, preparation, and willingness to die would overcome material disadvantage. Every Japanese soldier on Saipan had been instructed to kill 7 Americans before dying. The arithmetic seemed inexorable. 30,000 defenders killing 7 enemies each would inflict over 200,000 casualties. No democracy could sustain such losses. This calculation failed to account for the fundamental difference between the two forces. Japanese troops were prepared to die. American forces were prepared to kill. The distinction would prove decisive. On the evening of June 14th, as Admiral Nagumo and General Saito reviewed their defenses one final time, neither man could conceive of what would unfold in the coming weeks. They saw American ships on the horizon and believed they understood American intentions. Seize the island if possible, but withdraw if casualties became unacceptable. They could not imagine that American commanders would commit whatever forces necessary to take Saipan regardless of cost. They could not imagine that the massive fleet offshore was merely the opening wave of an operation that would ultimately land over 70,000 troops. They could not imagine that American industrial capacity could sustain material losses they were about to inflict and replace them within weeks. Most fundamentally, they could not imagine that their carefully prepared defenses, their artillery on the heights, their machine gun nests and concrete pillboxes, their determined garrison ready to die for the emperor, would prove insufficient, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the Americans possessed something more powerful than either. They possessed the industrial capacity to produce overwhelming force, the logistical capability to sustain it, and the operational doctrine to apply it with devastating effect. The American invasion fleet lay offshore through the night of June 14th. Over 8,000 Marines in the first wave checked their equipment, wrote final letters home, and tried to sleep in the crowded troop compartments below decks. At dawn, they would board the landing vehicles that would carry them across the lagoon to the beaches. For many, it would be their last sunrise. At 05:42, on the morning of June 15th, 1944, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner issued the order from his flagship, "Land the landing force." Within minutes, the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in the Pacific theater began to unfold with mechanical precision. 700 landing craft moved toward their assembly points. Landing ships tank, the LSTs that sailors called large, slow targets, moved to positions 1,250 yards behind the line of departure. Inside their cavernous holds, Marines climbed down into landing vehicles tracked, the amphibious tractors that would carry them across the lagoon to the beaches. Each LVT held approximately 20 men with full combat equipment. The assault plan called for 8 battalion landing teams to hit 4 beaches simultaneously. The 2nd Marine Division would land on red and green beaches north of Afetna Point. The 4th Marine Division would land on blue and yellow beaches near the village of Charan Kanoa. The first wave consisted of 68 armoured amphibious tractors mounting 75mm howitzers or 37mm guns. These would provide covering fire for the following waves of troop-carrying LVTs. At 0810, the first wave began its run to the beach. Control vessels displaying coloured flags marked each beach approach. Naval gunfire support ships moved closer to shore, their guns elevated to fire just ahead of the advancing tractors. The final bombardment intensified. Battleships fired 14-inch and 16-inch shells. Cruisers added 8-inch and 6-inch rounds. Destroyers contributed 5-inch shells. LCI gunboats, small infantry landing craft converted into floating artillery platforms, advanced ahead of the assault waves, their rockets and 40mm guns hammering the beach defences. Japanese artillery observers on the heights overlooking the beaches had watched this preparation for hours. They had placed ranging flags on the reef and in the lagoon, markers that would enable their gunners to deliver accurate fire. General Saito had ordered his artillery to hold fire until the American landing craft reached the lagoon. Maximum effect required patience. At 0840, the 1st Marines hit the beach. The 2nd Division's 6th Marines landed approximately 400 yards north of their assigned beach. The 8th Marines landed closer to their designated positions. On the 4th Division front, the 23rd and 25th Marines landed on their assigned beaches south of Charan Kanoa. Then, Japanese artillery opened fire. 75mm field pieces and 105mm howitzers, positioned on reverse slopes to avoid the naval bombardment, now found their range. Shells bracketed the landing craft, still crossing the lagoon. Direct hits exploded amphibious tractors. Some sank immediately, others burned, their fuel tanks ignited by hot shrapnel. Marines struggled to escape sinking vehicles, shedding equipment to stay afloat in water churned by explosions. Machine guns opened fire from concealed positions in the cliffs and ruins of Charan Kanoa. Interlocking fields of fire covered the beaches. Mortars added their distinctive crump and whistle to the cacophony. Shells burst among the Marines as they exited their tractors and sought cover. Marine Captain John Chapin, coming ashore in the first wave, later described what he saw. Bodies lying in mangled and grotesque positions, blasted and burned out pillboxes, the burning wrecks of LVTs, the acrid smell of high explosives, the shattered trees and churned-up sand littered with discarded equipment. By 0900, 8,000 Marines were ashore. They had established a beachhead approximately 6 miles wide and advanced up to half a mile inland in most sectors. But the cost had been severe. The 2nd Marine Division lost 31 of 68 armoured amphibious tractors in their sector alone. Casualties mounted rapidly. By the end of the first day, American forces suffered over 2,000 casualties killed and wounded. Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions. Trenches and barbed wire behind the beaches channeled American advance into killing zones. Concrete pillboxes, their walls 3 feet thick, required direct hits from naval gunfire or tank rounds to destroy. Snipers fired from trees, ruined buildings, and spider holes. Machine gun nests covered every approach. But the Americans kept coming. Wave after wave of landing craft crossed the lagoon. By nightfall, 20,000 troops were ashore. Artillery batteries had landed. Sherman tanks clawed their way up from the beaches. Supply dumps began to accumulate ammunition, rations, water, and medical supplies. General Saito watched from his command post in the hills. His forces had inflicted significant casualties. They had contested every yard of beach, but the Americans had not been stopped. They had not been thrown back into the sea. They continued to pour ashore in numbers that exceeded his most pessimistic estimates. The scale of the American operation was becoming apparent, and it was staggering. That night, Saito ordered a counterattack. The 136th Infantry Regiment and the 9th Tank Regiment would attack toward Charankanoa with full force. 35 tanks, Type 97 medium tanks and Type 95 light tanks, supported by approximately 1,000 infantry, would drive through the American lines and split the 2 Marine divisions. The attack began after midnight. Japanese tanks advanced down the coastal road, infantry following. But the coordination was poor. Naval infantry units that were supposed to support the attack failed to participate. American defenders heard the tanks coming. Bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, Sherman tanks, and self-propelled 75mm howitzers opened fire at close range. Private First Class Herbert Hodges destroyed 7 Japanese tanks within minutes with his bazooka. Another Marine knocked out 4 tanks before running out of ammunition, then disabled a 5th with a hand grenade. An offshore destroyer added its 5-inch gun to the engagement, literally blowing 1 tank apart at 7 in the morning. By dawn, all but one of the attacking tanks had been destroyed. Their burning wrecks littered the battlefield. Saito's counterattack had failed completely. On the morning of June 17th, the beachhead was secure. Over 33,000 tons of supplies had been unloaded. The cost had been 3,500 casualties in 3 days, but American forces now held a lodgment that could not be dislodged. The mathematics of the battle had begun to shift inexorably against the defenders. Admiral Nagumo and General Saito now faced a reality that contradicted everything their strategic assumptions had promised. The Americans had not been deterred by casualties. They had not withdrawn after the first day's losses. They were not conserving forces or seeking to minimize risks. They were committing whatever resources necessary to take the island. More disturbing was the sheer abundance of American materiel. Japanese intelligence had reported 15,000 enemy troops. The actual number exceeded 70,000. Japanese observers counted over 500 ships offshore. The supply dumps, growing on the beaches, contained more ammunition than the entire Japanese garrison possessed. American artillery fired more shells in single days than Japanese forces could fire in weeks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The disparity in industrial capacity manifested in every aspect of the battle. American forces carried over 1 ton of supplies per soldier, 32 days of rations, 30 days of medical supplies, 20 days of maintenance supplies, 7 days of ammunition for ground weapons, 10 days of anti-aircraft ammunition. The invasion fleet had transported these supplies from bases over 3,000 miles away. Additional supplies arrived daily from Eniwetok, 1,000 miles distant. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Operation Downfall was cancelled. The projected casualties from invading Japan never materialized. Whether the atomic bombings were necessary to achieve surrender remains debated by historians. What is indisputable is that the capability to deliver those weapons existed because Saipan had been captured 11 months earlier. The strategic bombing campaign conducted from the Marianas fundamentally altered the Pacific War. Between November 1944 and August 1945, B-29s flew over 25,000 individual sorties and dropped 170,000 tons of bombs on Japan. 371 bombers were lost. The campaign destroyed Japan's capacity to sustain war production, disrupted internal communications, and demonstrated to the Japanese population that their government could not protect them. None of this would have been possible without Saipan. The island's location, 1,500 miles from Tokyo, placed it at precisely the distance necessary for superfortress operations. Closer islands like Iwo Jima, captured in February 1945, provided emergency landing fields and fighter bases, but could not accommodate the massive bomber bases required for sustained operations. More distant bases in China had proven logistically unsustainable. Saipan represented the fulfillment of American Pacific strategy. Island hopping had not been timidity or casualty aversion. It had been ruthless strategic efficiency. American forces bypassed Japanese strongholds that contributed nothing to strategic objectives. They seized objectives that enabled the next phase of operations. Each island captured shortened the distance to Japan and lengthened Japanese supply lines. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. Guadalcanal secured Australia's supply lines. The Gilbert Islands provided bases to attack the Marshalls. The Marshalls provided bases to attack the Marianas. The Marianas provided bases to attack Japan itself. Each step was calculated. Each battle served a strategic purpose. Resources were not wasted attacking positions that could be isolated and neutralized without direct assault. Japanese strategic planning had fundamentally misunderstood this approach. Japanese commanders interpreted American bypassing of strongholds as evidence of unwillingness to accept casualties. They fortified positions they deemed critical, confident that making them costly enough to assault would deter American attack. They failed to recognize that Americans would attack any position whose strategic value justified the cost, and would ignore any position whose strategic value did not. This miscalculation was visible throughout the Pacific campaign. Rabaul, with over 100,000 Japanese troops, was isolated and left to wither. Truk, Japan's primary naval base in the Central Pacific, was neutralized by air attack and bypassed. Massive. Fortifications on numerous islands never saw combat because they controlled nothing essential to American strategic objectives. Saipan could not be bypassed. Its airfields were essential. Its location was critical. Its capture would bring B-29 bombers within range of Japan. Therefore, Americans committed whatever forces necessary to take it. The garrison fought with extraordinary courage and determination. They inflicted significant casualties. But courage and determination could not overcome material superiority measured in orders of magnitude. The battle demonstrated the fundamental asymmetry between the combatants. Japan possessed limited industrial capacity, constrained resources, and extended supply lines vulnerable to interdiction. The United States possessed virtually unlimited industrial capacity, abundant resources, and secure supply lines spanning the Pacific. When Japan lost equipment, it could not be replaced. When Japan lost trained personnel, they could not be adequately replaced. When Japan expended ammunition and supplies, resupply was uncertain. American forces suffered equivalent or greater casualties in individual engagements, but could replace losses within weeks or months. Ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, and returned to action. Aircraft shot down were replaced by new production. Casualties were replaced by trained personnel from an apparently inexhaustible reserve. The disparity was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative. American operational doctrine evolved continuously throughout the war. Lessons learned at Tarawa improved operations at Kwajalein. Experience at Kwajalein informed planning for Saipan. Each operation incorporated innovations in tactics, equipment, and procedures. Naval gunfire support became more accurate. Amphibious landing techniques improved. Combined arms coordination reached levels of sophistication that Japanese forces could not match. Japanese doctrine remained largely static. Defensive. Tactics employed at Saipan were essentially identical to those used at Tarawa 6 months earlier. Beach defense followed by withdrawal to prepared positions in rugged terrain. Nighttime counterattacks. Final banzai charges when defeat became inevitable. These tactics maximized American casualties but could not prevent ultimate defeat. Japanese forces learned from experience, but lacked the resources and time to implement systematic improvements. The human cost of Saipan extended beyond military casualties. Over 22,000 civilians died during the battle. Many were killed in combat. Others committed suicide, driven by propaganda that portrayed Americans as barbaric murderers who would torture and kill prisoners. Japanese soldiers sometimes forced civilians to jump from cliffs rather than allow them to surrender. The tragedy at Marpi Point, where hundreds of civilians leaped to their deaths, remains one of the most haunting images of the Pacific War. For the Marines and soldiers who fought on Saipan, the experience was transformative. Those who survived carried memories of the fighting for the rest of their lives. The landscapes of Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge were seared into their consciousness. The sounds of combat, the smell of death, the exhaustion of continuous fighting in tropical heat, these memories did not fade with time. 7 medals of honor were awarded for actions on Saipan. All were posthumous. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, Private First Class Harold Agerholm, Captain Ben Salomon, Private Thomas Baker, Lieutenant Colonel Aquila Dias, Private Joseph Osborne, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert McCard. Each citation told a story of extraordinary valor in circumstances of extreme danger. Their sacrifice exemplified the cost of taking Saipan. For Japanese survivors, the aftermath was equally profound. The 931 prisoners taken represented less than 3% of the garrison. Most had been too severely wounded to commit suicide or continue fighting. They faced an uncertain future as prisoners of war, marked by the shame of surrender in a culture that valued death over capture. Many struggled with survivors' guilt for decades afterward. The strategic consequences of Saipan's fall reverberated through the Japanese government. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had publicly promised Saipan would never fall, resigned on July 18, 1944. His cabinet collapsed. Emperor Hirohito, informed that Tokyo would now be bombed from Saipan's airfields, began to question whether the war could be won. The first cracks appeared in the facade of inevitable Japanese victory. Within the American command structure, Saipan validated the Central Pacific strategy championed by Admiral Chester Nimitz. The debate between Nimitz's island-hopping approach through the Central Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur's advance through the Southwest Pacific had consumed considerable energy at the highest levels of command. Saipan demonstrated that the Central Pacific route could deliver decisive strategic results. The success also validated the enormous investment in amphibious warfare doctrine and equipment. The LVTs that carried Marines across Saipan's lagoon under fire, the specialized landing ships that delivered heavy equipment to contested beaches, the naval gunfire support doctrine that enabled pinpoint bombardment of targets identified by forward observers. All of these capabilities had been developed through years of training and combat experience. 80 years after the battle, Saipan remains American territory as part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The island's economy depends on tourism. Visitors can still walk the invasion beaches. Rusting Japanese tanks remain where they were destroyed in June 1944. Memorials commemorate both American and Japanese dead. The cliffs at Marpi Point, where civilians died in the final days of the battle, are preserved as a site of remembrance. The airfield from which B-29 struck Japan is now Saipan International Airport. Commercial aircraft land on runways built by Seabees during the battle. Few passengers know they are traveling through a site where thousands died, and where the strategic bombing campaign that helped end World War II began. The story of Saipan illustrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Strategic vision matters more than tactical prowess. Industrial capacity determines outcomes more than individual valor. Logistics and sustainment win campaigns more than brilliant battlefield maneuvers. The Japanese garrison on Saipan fought with extraordinary courage and skill. They were defeated not by superior fighting ability, but by superior strategic planning, overwhelming material resources, and relentless operational execution. The miscalculation that led Japanese commanders to smirk at island hopping, believing Americans would avoid costly assaults on fortified positions, cost Japan the war. When Americans determined that an objective was strategically essential, they committed whatever force was necessary to seize it. Casualties were accepted as the price of strategic necessity. Resources were marshaled on a scale that Japanese planners could not comprehend, and once committed, American forces did not withdraw or seek compromise. They continued operations until objectives were achieved. Admiral Nagumo and General Saito had stood in that command post on the morning of June 14, 1944, confident that their defences would inflict unacceptable casualties on the invaders. They believed superior fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage. They assumed Americans would withdraw when losses mounted. Every assumption was wrong. Every belief was shattered by the reality of American industrial power and strategic determination. 25 days later, both men were dead. The island they had sworn to defend was in American hands. And from its airfields, B-29 superfortresses were preparing to bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The lesson was clear to anyone willing to see it. The age of warfare, decided by individual courage and tactical skill, had ended. The age of industrial warfare, where production capacity and logistical sustainment determined outcomes, had begun. The Battle of Saipan was not the largest battle of the Pacific War. It was not the bloodiest, though casualties on both sides were severe. But it was among the most strategically consequential. Its capture enabled the strategic bombing campaign that brought Japan to its knees. Its loss precipitated the political crisis in Tokyo that would ultimately lead to surrender. And its planning and execution demonstrated the asymmetry in resources and capabilities that made Japanese defeat inevitable. When Marines waded ashore on June 15, 1944, they were not simply seizing another island. They were executing a strategy that would win the Pacific War. The cost was high. The fighting was brutal. But the outcome was never in doubt once American forces committed to taking Saipan. Not because American soldiers and Marines were braver than Japanese defenders, but because American industrial capacity, logistical capability, and strategic vision had created conditions where courage alone could not prevent defeat. That was the truth. Admiral Nagumo and General Saito learned too late. That was the lesson Saipan taught. Island hopping was not weakness, it was strategic mastery. And when the strategy required taking a position, Americans would pay whatever price victory demanded. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.